So hi everybody and welcome to our Governance Playbook webinar series. Our session today is how to run a robust board meeting cycle. My name's Sean McDonald and I'll be your moderator for the next 45 minutes. Now during our session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A buttons at the bottom of the screen or the chat button and we'll be answering these at the end of each section and try to get through as many of those questions as we possibly have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you do, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper from our friends at Taken Care Of worth over $400. Now, for those of you who don't know BoardPro, we're a board software provider that serve over 13,000 users around the world, and we enable organizations to run their board and committee meetings more effectively, more efficiently with less time and deliver more impact and value for their organization. And as much as we're a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints such as small to medium enterprises and non-profits. So today, let me introduce our presenter and panel for our webinar today. Steve Bowman is Managing Director of Conscious Governance and brings a great depth of experience with board reviews and strategic planning. Stephen has a wealth of executive and governance experience and has written over 14 books on governance and strategy, would you believe? Good afternoon, Stephen.
Hi, everyone, and I'm looking forward to this discussion today.
Brett is our co-founder and CEO here at BoardPro. Brett's an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, having built several high-growth businesses over the last 20-odd years. Good afternoon to you, Brett.
Hello and kia ora to everyone.
And leaning on 20 years of international governance and board appointment experience, Simon Telfer offers practical, real-world governance advice. He's a regular commentator on issues facing directors, particularly those in privately owned businesses. Simon is founder of the 18,000 plus member Appoint Better Boards community, and was an early pioneer of diversity in boards in New Zealand.
Thank you, Sean. Look forward to contributing over the next 43 minutes.
Thanks, Simon. Our webinar series is centered around what we call our 3x5 Governance Playbook, and Brett is the author and creator. Brett, would you like to explain why we created the playbook and what value it delivers people?
Yeah, sure. So really this effort has been drawn out of us by the market. So we have started off as a technology business providing governance technology, but we serve a median organization. We serve as a charity with a couple of $1 million of revenue or a commercial organization with 25 million. And many of those organizations are early in their governance journey. They're building their capability and experience. And we get a lot of questions on our chat feature, not just how to use the technology, but how to do governance well. So we've basically responded to that need by saying, well, what's minimum viable governance? How can we support the journey of so many of our customers? So we're in the process of building out a suite of tools, very practical tools and templates and very digestible guidance as part of our wider contribution, as Sean has already touched on. And you see here via the slides here that we've built it around this construct of, 5 fundamental processes that a board would run with 5 inputs and 5 outputs.
Thanks, Brett. So, Stephen, opening the floor to your good self.
Why, thank you. So this is a conversation that we're going to have with all the panels around this. I'll sort of lead it to some extent and put some thoughts forward on this, but when you see the title board meeting cycles, robust board meeting cycles, very few people get goosebumps listening to that. But what I want to do is to bring a different perspective about how we can structure our board meeting cycles that are actually got a real purpose behind them rather than we meet because we've always met because we've always met. So the board gets its authority from its ability to make decisions as a collective, and the board meetings are in fact the main mechanism by which we deliver against that authority that we've got. And so therefore it makes sense as a board that we need to really give some thought to what sort of meetings, how often, what's the cycle that we need to have in there. And so I've come up with 4 different things that I think all boards should really reflect upon when looking at what are these board meeting cycles. You know, where I know a board hasn't really thought about it is when they tell me we meet 12 months a year because we've always met every 12 months because that's the way we do things around here. And there's very little reflection in there about, well, what do we actually need? So the first thing I'd put to you is these 4 key issues. The first one is to understand and continuously reflect on the role of the board. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go through each of the other 3 as time goes on. So reflecting on the role of the board, most people, when you ask them what is the role of the board, they'll talk about things like, you know, strategy and risk and fiduciary oversight and managing the staff and a whole range of different things. But often boards have forgotten why they exist in the first place. And what I'd like to put to you is that the key role of any board, whether you're in the corporate sector, the non-profit sector, the governmental sector, it doesn't matter. The role of any board should be to make the choices that create the future for the communities that we serve. And if we take that as a working definition of the role of the board, each of those are incredibly powerful. Now, the reason I'm saying this is when we design our meetings, we have to actually facilitate each of these 3 elements. So by making choices, we've got to understand what a choice is. Most directors think that they're there to make decisions. Now, most people, not necessarily people on this call, but most people think a decision has to be final because it cannot be revisited. Once we've made a decision, then that's the decision, and we have to stick with it because, after all, it's a decision. So it's final. And then a lot of people also view a decision as the answer. This is the right thing. This is the only thing. It is the one decision to rule all other decisions. Once we have it, we stop looking for alternatives because, after all, we've made the decision. And then the third thing that people think about decisions is, well, it has to be right. Because if it's not right, then by definition, it's wrong. And if we've got to make sure it's right, because these decisions last forever and ever and ever, then if we don't get it right, we'll get it wrong. And then we're stuck with the wrongness forever and ever and ever. Now, it's happening in the back of our minds. It's a paradigm that people buy into. So the key thing in this notion about choices is to understand that we are here to know that there are multiple choices, and we need to, amongst these choices, choose one. And then if we've chosen one, we need to monitor whether that choice is still working. And if it's not working, we need to be able to change that choice on a dime. We need to be able to change that choice and make a different choice without having to give it to another subcommittee and then waiting 6 months and then hoping it'll all work out. We need to be able to move very, very quickly. More so important for startup companies and for family-owned businesses where you actually can't lock yourself into a decision, because that then becomes a fixed point of view on something. If we understand that we're working from choices, we're always monitoring those choices. Simon, your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm really interested that there's sort of some agility there. And does that then open up the chance that people want to relitigate decisions if we're framing them as choices? And what happens when the going gets tough? You know, does that then sort of give the board a bit of an out, going, well, it's getting a little bit tough, so should we just re-choose where the direction we're heading or the decision that we made?
And that's always the issue with any of these things, is that if someone wants to relitigate, no matter what, they're going to relitigate. You know, it's the broken record, the pet project that comes up. Choice is all about understanding there's multiple ways of doing things. The way that we're doing it at the moment, is it the way that is going to create the greatest impact that we want to have, either financially or in terms of community impact, in terms of our customers? So we as a board need to be focused on, is this creating the outcomes that we're after within the time frame that we're after? If it's not, we need to start looking at what other options might be, and then we get to choose whether to change or not. A good board will have those really robust discussions. The difficulty that most organisations fall into, and many boards fall into, is when they think they've got something right and they never look at what else might be possible. They never even see the disruptors that might be coming down the track.
I think, Steve, also that's a good reason for refreshing a board, because what can happen over a period of time if the same directors or same board members are in a board and they look back at decisions that need to be changed, but because they personally made it and they don't want to admit that maybe they got it wrong, then there's no fresh thinking and no fresh challenge. So it just continues, those decisions continue. So there is, I know this is a board cycle conversation, but there's also board composition and refreshing that. So that group think and that hanging on to decisions because they were decisions we made, that needs to be reflected on as well.
Absolutely. And the other part to build into that is, as soon as you as a director think the board's becoming a bit comfortable in something, turn up the heat a little bit, make it a little bit more uncomfortable. For example, what if we couldn't do it this way? What are the different ways that we haven't considered of? What if someone came in and did something that was even better than us? What's our response to that likely to be? And we'll cover that as we go through a little bit more of this. So the role of the board is to make choices and to be nimble, to be aware of whether those choices are still working. And then the second part, to make choices that create the future. Sean, can you go back one slide? That's it. We're not there to make sure the staff are busy. We're there to create the future. And we've run other webinars on what does that look like and the role of the vision and so on. But our role as a board is not to receive reports, but it's actually to create the future through the choices that we make. And to do that, we've got to really understand that the only thing we know about the future is that we don't know. We've got some ideas, but we don't know. So if any organisation is saying, here's the future that we want to create, then they're probably missing out on all the other possibilities that could be created by being aware that there's multiple futures out there. So we need, as part of our board meeting cycles, to build into it reflection and insight about what some of the futures might be into the future and what is it that we need to know about now so that we can position ourselves to take or to leverage off any of these futures that may occur. So our role is to create the future, not to receive reports on how busy everyone's been. Brett, thoughts?
Yeah, I love it. All I would say, Stephen, is this has been a recurring theme from, some very good panelists over the last sort of 6-9 months we've been doing this, and it's actually influenced me as the CEO as I write my CEO reports each month to move away. There's always a temptation as a busy executive to default into talking about what's happening, and it keeps driving me, this webinar series to go, well, what's the future I'm creating? I'm working with the board, under delegated authority, but working with them to create that future. So I'm now much more actively, trying to report on that every month.
And it also cascades down into your board committees. For example, I'm seeing in the last 2 years, I'm seeing something occur that I've never seen happen before at the rate it is, and that is the creation of a board committee, which is called sometimes the Strategy and Stakeholder Committee or the Stakeholder Engagement Committee. There was one just yesterday that I was working with that have called themselves the Community Engagement Committee, and it's a for-profit organisation. And what they're starting to do is they're starting to look 10 years down the track. And what do we need to put in place to have the stakeholder engagement, the community engagement, whoever our communities are, whether they be customers and people that are affected by the customers, but they're looking at 10 years and maybe 5 years down the track, not just what we need to do in the next 6 months. And that's another way of actually getting your board committees to start looking at not just doing the work, but actually having a look with a much larger time frame and working backwards from that. And what do we need to put in place to start creating that now? So to make the choices that create the future for the communities that we serve, what is this difference that we want to make? One of the most powerful conversations that a board should have, at least on an annual basis, is who are our key stakeholders? Who are they this year? Let's see if they've changed from previous years. And just that very conversation is, well, what do we mean by a key stakeholder? And certainly my point of view as a key stakeholder, I define it as those people whose points of view really matter to us. Who are these people? Not the organisations. Who are these people whose points of view really matter to us? Now, How are we engaging? What should we be engaging? Simon, thoughts?
I love the term communities, and I know that often that's sort of a default for the not-for-profit world, but I see more and more that sense of, when we're talking about ESG and social license, we're talking about communities within a for-profit sense as well. So I think that sort of language has certainly changed over the last few years. And just coming to your point about future focus, I'm really pleased that, having seen this presentation, we're going to be looking at the agenda, because I think the agenda really sets the tone for how future focused a board conversation is. And around future focus, I live in New Zealand, and our Indigenous population is the Maori population. And I think they've had a really big influence too over governance in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, which is the Maori name for New Zealand, because their time frame is 100 years from now. And that, when we're looking at doing a 3-year plan or something like that, and they're talking about what would our grandchildren's grandchildren experience. And I think that's really interesting, how the Indigenous population or Indigenous governance community is helping to shape the more commercial governance language and approach here in New Zealand.
It's also happening in Canada a lot too, Simon, where they talk about the 7 generations perspective. And that's from the Indigenous cultures over there, and that's being brought in. So it's this much wider thing. One of the great, this is off track a little bit, but in one of these board committees, which was the Strategy and Stakeholder Engagement Committee, their task was to look at the intractable problems that the board or the organisation had not been able to address in the last 40 years. And that's a big ask. And it's really got them focused, in 10 and 20 years. What is it that we want to see? Now, it's a bit like the phrase, how do you eat an elephant? Well, you eat it one bite at a time. But understand what is it that you want to have created in that time frame. Now, let's start putting in place the sorts of things that we can start doing now and in 2 years and 4 years. So moving back to board cycles, there's 2 elements, and Simon touched on it. One of them is looking at your board cycle as an annual event. What do we need to do over the year? And then the other component is looking at then in each board meeting, what is our agenda going to be for that board meeting? So we'll talk about those a little bit further on. So the first thing is for the board to get its head around why we exist. Strategy is a tool, risk is a tool, finance is a tool, governance, they're all tools to help us make the choices that create the future for the communities we serve. And sometimes we focus too much on the tools rather than why we're there in the first place. So let's look at the second point here, which is once we've got our mindset where it probably needs to be, let's look at some strategic reflection, build that into the board meeting cycles. So it makes sense that for every board meeting, what we need to do is to review and reflect on our existing and what other choices there are available to us. So if we're having board reports coming up to us, they need to be focused not only on what are the impact measures or the outcome measures from this particular activity, but there's 2 great questions that I really encourage everyone on this call to consider. And there's 2 great questions that you can build into every single board report where appropriate. The first great question is, what are the strategic implications behind this report? And then the second question, what are the strategic questions that we want the board to consider? And so what that does is it enables us to review and reflect and not just receive report on activity. And then the other thing is we need to monitor how close we are to agreed outcomes. Don't give me a 150-page board pack that talks about how busy we are and all the programs and how we're going. We know you're busy, right? But what are the outcomes? How close are we? What are the barriers to these outcomes we've already agreed that we want? What are the different ways that we could think that we think that we might achieve some of these outcomes? Are they still the outcomes that we're after? This fundamentally changes the conversation around the board paper, around the board table.
So could I jump in, Stephen, and ask you a question there? So let's make this very practical. So let's imagine I'm putting a paper up to the board to get approval for a new person onto the senior leadership team.
Yep.
So if I extrapolate from what you're saying here, I might have a little section in that report saying, look, in terms of our strategy, this person will help deliver X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. Is that the type of example you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, for that specific example, the first thing I'd say is, well, have I got a policy in place that very clearly delegates at what level can I include staff and what level I can't, because we're in a growth phase. So therefore my policy around staff recruitment might be, we'll look for the sort of the operational staff, you have full ability to do that. But for some of the really strategic areas, we as a board might want to get involved. So that'd be my first question. Having got that, then here's the staff member coming up. My policy says I have to bring it to the board. So what I'm going to bring to the board is, here are the things that we looked at. Here are the options that we had. Here is the preferred option that I've got. Here's how this is going to have an impact on vision and our core strategies, and how this position and how this person, from our point of view, is going to actually create these changes. And then lastly, I'd probably have, here's what I'm thinking of in terms of key performance indicators for this position.
Very nice linkage back to the active there, to the execution, Stephen.
Okay, so let's move on to the third thing. So we've looked at role of the board, the way we think. We've looked at designing strategic reflection into all of our meetings. The third thing that we need to look at then is how does this relate to things like the annual work plan? We've got two amazing tools as a board that we can use, and they're usually done pretty badly. So the first one is your annual work plan. Now, don't try and read this. I just want to give you an idea. You will get 2, if not 3 examples that you will have as templates that you can use as part of this webinar series. But a board work plan, an annual work plan, shouldn't just be about the dates that we're going to meet. It should have a focus on the topics that we're going to focus on as well. And one of the things that we strongly recommend for boards to look at is to say, okay, it's never about having more meetings. You shouldn't be focusing on having more meetings to do more work. You should be focusing on making sure the meetings we have are fit for purpose and cover off on the things that are actually worthwhile the board spending its time on. So more and more now we're seeing boards who, let's say, for example, have 10 or 12 meetings a year. The first question is why? Often the response to that is because. We always have. But if you start looking at the board meeting cycle, however many you've got, one of the things that we strongly suggest is that you allocate at least 2 of those meetings as strategy meetings, looking at big strategic issues that are coming up. Non-agendaed. You don't need an agenda for this. You might need someone who's going to facilitate that, but once or twice a year, we as a board will meet during our normal board meeting time of 2.5 or 3 hours, and we will be focused on just looking at key emerging strategies. Or some boards have said, we're going to spend this time having a look at the scenarios, some key scenarios that have been developed, or in fact, develop up some key scenarios as part of that meeting. A great suggestion for all boards is every 2 or 3 years to actually look at developing up a scenario planning session to look at what are the possible maybe perhapses, the ifs, the maybe nots, so that we as a board can get outside of just monitoring what we already know. And there's different ways of doing that. You can do scenario planning, you can do causal layered analysis, you can look all this stuff up. The other one is called spiral dynamics. There's different ways of doing this, but it gets us outside of just the board work and gets us to look at one of our key gifts we are as a board, which is making choices that create the future for the communities that we serve. So your annual board work plan, probably I would suggest 6 or 7 meetings a year where it's focused on the normal board stuff, the strategy, the governance, the risk, the reports against outcomes that we're wanting to, maybe up to 2 meetings a year where we focus on emerging strategic issues. You may bring in external people to help facilitate that or to start off the conversations. And then 1 or 2 meetings around specific topics. You might have a very strong alumni section, for example. This just happened yesterday. where there was this leadership organisation, government-funded leadership organisation, and their greatest strength was their alumni. But they've never really spent quality time talking about how can we leverage our alumni to further strengthen leadership. So they're going to spend 2.5 hours with some option papers coming up to them, really exploring that in depth. So have a look at board meeting cycles where it's not just here's business as usual with maybe some changes to the agenda, but actually having 2 sessions that are really focused on strategy, deep dive into strategy, and 1 or 2 sessions that are a deep dive into a particular topic. That way you don't load your directors up with meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting.
Yeah, Steve, I think there's a really good point, Steve, that you're talking about weaving it in, because I've concerned, historically that on a board work plan, there would be the annual strategy away day, and the board sort of goes away and does their blue sky thinking and does that and thinks, thank goodness we've done our strategy thinking for the year. And I think that's one of the challenges when you have a strategy away day is it almost conditions us to think that's when we think strategically, and everything else we don't think strategically. So I think that's the first point. I tend to also, I know you say 2 plus 2 full sort of strategy type sessions. I love the idea of bringing in external people to speak and present and to stimulate some conversation. And then when they've left the meeting after an hour or so, making sure that you spend an extra half an hour on the agenda to say, what did we learn from that? What do we disagree? What did that stimulate? When can we apply that? I think that's really, really helpful too when you get that external stimulus. And the other side of thing is, how can you weave strategic conversations into every agenda but not get strategy fatigue? Because strategy by its very nature is longer term, it's bigger picture. So you shouldn't be tweaking the strategy all the time, but you should be reflecting what's happened in the last 6 weeks or the last 2 months that may be influencing our strategy thinking, but not sort of going, oh, here we go again. We've got to just let this sit a little bit. We can't just keep meddling with it. I thought you had a really good term. Was that strategic gossip or something like that, or gossip?
Strategic gossip. Absolutely. Yeah. Simon, you've given the greatest segue into the agenda management side of things.
That's what I'm doing.
There's a number of different ways that we do this, and you will all get a copy of a sample strategic agenda. And can I just say, when you look at it, make it your own. Take the bits out of it that make sense. Don't use the bits that don't make sense to you. But there's a couple of elements in there that can really, really assist to bring strategy into everything without relitigating whether or not these strategies without getting into the big picture thing, are they still the right strategies? You can do that annually. You can do that through some of these other mechanisms. But here are some great tips. The first one is, if you're not already doing it, for heaven's sake, put your vision statement on the top of every page of the agenda to remind our board that's why we're here. We're not here to meet. We're here to make sure that we achieve whatever this vision is, whatever this purpose, whatever it is that you call it. That's our biggest strategic focus more than anything else. That's our big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAGs, if you've heard of those. But please make sure it's there and make sure it's used. The second thing is, at the end of each agenda, some people put it at the start of the agenda, have something called strategic gossip. And strategic gossip is where you ask your directors or your staff, your senior staff, what have you heard? What have you come across? What have you read? What have people said to you that might have far-reaching implications for us? What have you heard? What did you hear this came about where we had a number of directors that were hearing things at the barbecue on Sunday where they were with someone else, and someone said, oh, had you heard that X, Y, and Z was happening? Now, instead of bringing that story back to the board, I want my directors to reflect, well, what's the strategic implication of this? Here's the bit of gossip, but I think the bigger picture, and this is the impact this is likely to have potentially in 5 years. This is one of the whispers of the future that we want our senior executives and also our board to continually monitor, but bring it back with a strategic framework. So that's one thing. Second thing is, every 2 or 3 times a year, bring in an external stakeholder whose point of view really matters to us, and ask them to talk to our board about what are their top 2 strategic issues. And over the next 5 to 10 years? What are their 2 top strategic issues in the next 5 to 10 years? And what do they think the implications for our organisation might be? Our corporate, our non-profit, whatever type of organisation. Because you want to get access to other people's wisdom, but also to get them to look at it through the filter of what do I think that might mean for your organisation. And once you've done that, you can say thank you to them, and then you can reflect on your strategic plan for 3 or 4 years to see whether or not you've got stuff in place to deal with that if it were to occur. And if you don't, would it make sense? Even if this weren't to occur, it would make sense for us to do this. Really powerful. And then you can bring in senior executive, 2 or 3 times a year and get them to talk about what do they see as the top 2 strategic issues in their area of responsibility in the next 10 years. And that means that as a director, I'm getting to hear about strategic operational issues or operationally strategic issues, but again, tapping into the wisdom of our senior executives. Really simple to do, incredibly powerful conversations. Simon?
Stephen, we have a question here from Bo Delvey. What's your one advice to all of the boards on practicing conscious governance?
Okay. Someone said to me the other day, why are you calling it conscious governance? We've had this for 30 years. And he said, I can answer that because the alternative is probably not pretty good, which would be unconscious governance. And the whole idea about consciousness, just so that you understand, consciousness is about being aware of what is, not what you want it to be. And also having no judgment of whether something's good or bad, so that you can actually see what else is possible. And one of the greatest gifts that we have as directors in being this is if we function from that space of curiosity, if we function from that space of being the question, and which is that space of curiosity. And from there, we then ask the questions. A whole different conversation is about questions, but a good question unlocks everyone's wisdom. It's not there as a tool to prove you right and someone else wrong. So a really high performance board is one that is constantly in question, is constantly curious about what if, what else, what have we not talked about? What are we missing here? That's a really good board, and they're all strategic conversations. Excellent. Simon, coming back to agenda management.
And on that, it's that idea of strong ideas held lightly. That you come with a sense of conviction with your ideas and that sort of thing, but you lightly hold them so that you're able to flex and understand when maybe other points of view are better. At a very practical level, my experience from chairing, I find the first sort of hour of a meeting really, really powerful, and that's when I make sure that the strategic conversations are always right at the start of the agenda. And I always put them before things like, before matters arising from the previous meeting, right at the top. Now, the reason I do that is for sort of threefold. One, it's when everyone is freshest and has the most energy and really excited. So you're getting that creative thinking that you might not get at hour 3 or hour 4 or immediately after lunch. The second side of things is that if you have you're not having people starting to worry about catching their flight or catching a taxi or attending the next meeting. So you're giving plenty of thought space where people are really, really engaged in the meeting. And the other thing is that human ability to think. It's a lot easier to go broader down to narrower, but if you start your agenda with all the operational things, and then you're expecting people to start conditioning them to start thinking more broadly and widely, it's really, really difficult to invert the funnel. So I always start at the top and going down. So that's just some ideas around when you are doing the strategy work, thinking about where you're placing it within the agenda, where it's going to get the most attention and have the most energy.
Yeah, a little bit of supporting evidence for that, if you forgive the plug for BoardPro. So our standard agenda within the software position strategic and big conversations, discussions early in the agenda. And we've had a lot of feedback over the years that, exactly as Simon and Stephen are saying, that adds real value.
Can I just make an observation here? When I sent over the draft of the strategic agenda, Sean, can you get to that slide of the agenda? It was a Word format, and Sean translated it through the BoardPro software into the BoardPro template. And what came out of that was something even more powerful than what I'd sent him. So one of the issues that I know I talked about before is often when we're developing agendas, what if we were able to do it in a way that was a lot simpler, but we got our thinking around what should be in the agenda right first, and then the actual setting of the agenda becomes much, much simpler. Sean, did you want to say something on that?
Oh, no, not at this stage, Stephen.
Okay. So what you'll get as part of this is a sample agenda, and there's little call-out boxes in there that say why the agenda is structured this way. Just a very brief little story. I was talking to someone a few weeks ago and they sent me a copy of their board agenda, and it looked very, very similar to this agenda that you've got on screen there, with including the little call-out boxes. And I said, look, you don't need to put the call-out boxes on your agenda, because I've just put it in there to remind people about why we do it this way. And the CEO said, well, guess why I've left it in? To remind my board why we're doing it this way. I'll eventually take it out once they've changed their way of looking at agendas, but I want to keep it in there just to remind them why we're doing it. And he said, and that stopped a whole lot of, the old way was better sort of thing. I thought that was very funny. So
this one's going to throw you, Stephen.
No, it's not, because I'm going to throw to Brett on this one.
This was from the conversation we had yesterday. So, yeah, probably is best to go with Brett on this one.
Yeah, so look, we had, this is live real-time development of our webinar series. We had a fascinating conversation when we were doing our dry run yesterday with the panel. And essentially, we put the question to Stephen and Simon, do we have a view on what percentage of time should go to strategic versus oversight or compliance items? And Simon chimed in, well, actually, we want to be purposeful about relationship building as well. So without any real science, we threw this slide together to stimulate the conversation around how do you balance pragmatically, strategy versus oversight versus relationship, and then Simon can speak to, the movements with the board life cycle, how that might influence these different allocations as well. Is that enough intro for you to comment back, Stephen?
Oh, I'd like to, Simon. I mean, one of the things with Simon in particular is that you've got a lot of experience with startups and with corporations, family-owned business sort of thing. What are your thoughts on this, Simon?
Yeah, so when we were talking about the rhythm of board meetings and how frequently you should meet, I think I made that observation for those organisations for their first foray into governance. They're bringing in their first independent director or forming their board for the first time. I do encourage the meeting cycle to be more frequent, because I think that is when you're building that trust amongst you're getting your rhythm, you're building that trust, and a lot of that sort of relationship building to create a really healthy board dynamic can only sort of be done in person. Now, if you're only doing that 4 times a year, I'm just not quite sure that's frequent enough to really harness that quickly. So that's what I was thinking there around but when you've had a board that's been more established and understand each other, and maybe there's reasonably long-standing relationships there, then the interval between board meetings can possibly be elongated. Yeah, and the other thing was, around that pie chart, and I know that was just thrown together. It was more around the being thoughtful and with purposes about what we want to achieve from that next meeting. So if someone went back through old agendas and showed me the pie chart breakdown of where the board's focus was, and it was effectively exactly the same for every meeting for 10 meetings a year or 8 meetings a year, I'd probably have a little bit of concern that the chair was sort of almost going through the motions, and it was becoming a little bit rote there, as opposed to sort of saying, look, where is what's happening externally or what's happening internally, what's driving where the board should have its focus. So I think the pie was, rather than having a standard set, it was actually one that probably moved and ebbed and flowed over an annual board meeting cycle.
And it probably should reflect the annual board calendar, which shows that we'll have a different focus at a different time for a different reason, and we reserve the right to change it if it needs to change at any time. So all good examples there. The other thing that I would say then is developing up board papers. The most controversial topic at the moment. The number of organisations we've worked with in the last 3 months where they've said we've got a 250 or 300 page board pack. We want to cut it down, but we don't know how. And there's a culture that's been created as, if in doubt, give more information. So looking at structuring your board papers so that they actually give the board as the client what it is that they require to make these choices. And one of the best things that we can start to look at, and it's a very simple concept, but most boards don't even look at it, is every board paper is either going to be a paper for noting or a paper for information, or it's going to be a paper for discussion or a paper where we have to actually make a choice or make a decision. Those papers for discussion and those papers for decision, or there's recommendations attached, have to answer the question, so what? So what do you want me to focus on? What do you want me to do with this? What's the so what from this? And the best example of that are financials. I'd still say in probably 70% of all the board financials I see, most of them are technically correct, but informationally useless because they don't answer the so what. So what do you want us to talk about? So that's where these the question, particularly on your P&L, on your balance sheet and your cash flow, a great question to have at the bottom of that is strategic implications for board discussion. Distill it down into what it is that we need to have a focus on. What do we need to talk about from this? Don't just give me a whack of figures. Simon, thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about yesterday around those boards that run their board cycles based on when the management accounts come out, and just sort of how slightly fraught that can be because your board rhythm has been driven purely by the financial state of the business, and then a lot of those reportings are historical. What was the P&L for the month before? Whereas the balance sheet of today. But it's things like the cash flow that's most important because that's what's looking forward. What's our cash position going to be? What are the implications for that? How are we going to allocate resources around that? So there was that just not the tail wagging the dog a little bit around, structuring your board meetings just because that's when the finance team gets the accounts out of. Just be careful that that doesn't then sort of shape the agenda and the mood and the focus and the tone of the board.
Well, that also segues beautifully. We should do this more often, Simon. We're segueing greatly here. That segues into the role of board committees in all of this. This is the third element that we're covering in terms of what we need to reflect upon. You need to look at your board committees so that their cycle of meeting fits in with the annual board cycle as well too, and that there's a reason for them to meet, not just to do activities. I've seen too many organisations, it still happens to this day, where their finance meeting is an hour before the board meeting because it's convenient. That is not negotiable. That is just so wrong on so many different levels. So we need to look at when our committees should be meeting, not just to suit people, but when does it fit within the board cycle, the board meeting cycle, and the different things that we need to focus on. And the same thing goes for them. When they report back to the board, they shouldn't be reporting on activity. They should be reporting on strategic implications that is worthy of the board discussing, not just here's a report of the things that we've done. Okay, so Brett or Sean, did you want to talk about that last slide that you had up there?
I think we're just on time for everybody, Stephen. So I think we should just wrap things up. Unless Brett, Simon, you have any final comments?
We're all good. It's been a great session. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so feel free to connect with our presenters and panelists today on LinkedIn. Their details are on the screen there. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection. If you have any questions that come to mind that we would like to hear about, just fire them through on this email line here, hello@boardpro.io, and we'll turn those answers around as quick as we can. You'll receive an email from us soon after today's session, probably tomorrow now, where you'll find a copy of the webinar white paper, a link to the recording of the webinar, the 3 business templates that Stephen discussed today, and a full copy of the slide deck as presented. Now, just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey and go into the draw to win our hamper worth $400. We'll announce the winner tomorrow. So thanks everybody for your attendance. Thanks Stephen, thanks Simon, Brett for your contribution today. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers, bye everyone.